Part 1. The hook philosophy is everywhere. Right now, as you're reading these words, you're engaging in one of humanity's oldest and most essential activities. You're not just passively absorbing information. You're questioning, evaluating, and forming judgments about the truth of what I'm telling you. You're wondering whether my claims make sense, whether they align with your own experience, and whether they're worth your precious time and attention. In doing this, you're practicing philosophy. But philosophy isn't something that happens only when you're consciously thinking about abstract concepts or reading academic texts. It's woven into the fabric of your everyday existence in ways so fundamental that you rarely notice them. Every morning when you wake up, you make philosophical choices. Do you hit the snooze button or get up immediately? That seemingly simple decision reflects your beliefs about discipline, pleasure, responsibility, and what makes life worth living. When you choose what to wear, you're making statements about identity, social norms, and how you want to present yourself to the world. When you decide what to eat for breakfast, you're navigating questions of health, ethics, environmental impact, and personal satisfaction. The conversations you have throughout the day are peppered with philosophical assumptions. When a friend tells you about a problem they're facing and you offer advice, you're drawing on your beliefs about human nature, moral responsibility, and what constitutes a good life. When you discuss politics with a colleague, you're engaging with fundamental questions about justice, freedom, equality, and the proper role of government. When you watch the news and feel outraged by some injustice, you're expressing philosophical convictions about right and wrong, fairness and unfairness. Even your entertainment choices reflect philosophical commitments. The movies and books that move you, the music that speaks to your soul, the art that captures your imagination, all of these connect to deeper questions about beauty, meaning, truth, and human experience. When you find yourself deeply affected by a story, when a piece of music gives you chills, or when a painting stops you in your tracks, you're encountering philosophy in its most visceral form. You're confronting questions about what makes life meaningful, what beauty is, and how art can illuminate truths about the human condition that mere facts and figures cannot capture. Your relationships, too, are philosophical laboratories. Every friendship, romantic partnership, and family bond involves implicit philosophical questions. What do we owe to one another? How should we treat people we love? What does loyalty mean? How do we balance our own needs with the needs of others? When you feel hurt by someone's actions, when you struggle to forgive, when you experience love or jealousy or compassion, you're grappling with questions that have occupied philosophers for millennia. Your career choices and work life are similarly philosophical. The satisfaction you derive from your job, the way you balance work and personal life, your attitudes toward money and success, your relationships with colleagues and supervisors, all of these reflect deeper beliefs about human purpose, the nature of meaningful work, economic justice, and what constitutes a life well lived. When you feel unfulfilled at work, when you struggle with work-life balance, or when you contemplate changing careers, you're engaging with philosophical questions about identity, purpose, and value. Consider the technology that surrounds you. The smartphone in your pocket raises profound philosophical questions about privacy, human connection, the nature of knowledge, and what it means to live an authentic life in a digital age. Social media platforms force us to confront questions about identity, truth, community, and the ethics of influence. Artificial intelligence challenges our understanding of consciousness, creativity, and what makes us uniquely human. These aren't just technical or social issues. They're fundamentally philosophical ones that require us to examine our deepest beliefs about mind, reality, and human nature. The philosophical nature of ordinary life becomes even more apparent during moments of crisis or significant change. When you face a major decision, experience loss, confront illness, or encounter unexpected challenges, the philosophical foundations of your worldview become visible. You find yourself asking, what really matters? How should I spend my limited time? What do I believe about suffering, death, and meaning? What kind of person do I want to be? These aren't abstract intellectual exercises. They're urgent personal questions that demand philosophical reflection. But here's what's remarkable. Humans have been wrestling with these same fundamental questions for thousands of years. The ancient Greeks pondered the nature of justice. The Stoic philosophers developed frameworks for dealing with adversity. Buddhist thinkers explore the nature of suffering and liberation. Medieval scholars grapple with the relationship between faith and reason. Enlightenment philosophers examine the foundations of knowledge and political authority, and modern thinkers continue to investigate consciousness, ethics, and meaning in light of scientific discoveries and social changes. This means that when you encounter a difficult decision, feel confused about right and wrong, or wonder about the meaning of life, you're not alone. You're a part of an ongoing human conversation that spans cultures and centuries. The questions that keep you up at night are the same ones that have captivated the greatest minds in human history. The uncertainties you face are shared by every thinking person who has ever lived. What's even more extraordinary is that many of the insights generated by this long philosophical tradition remain startlingly relevant to your daily life. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his private journal while leading the Roman Empire, offers advice about dealing with difficult people and managing stress that feels like it could have been written yesterday. Aristotle's thoughts on friendship help illuminate the dynamics of your own relationships. Confucius's ideas about character development provide guidance for personal growth that rivals any modern self-help book. Simone de Beauvoir's analysis of gender and identity speaks directly to contemporary struggles for equality and authenticity. The universality and timelessness of philosophical questions suggests something profound about human nature. We are the creatures who cannot help but ask why, and what if, and how so we life. We are driven by an innate need to understand ourselves, our world, and our place within it. This questioning impulse is what makes us human, and it's what makes philosophy not just relevant but essential to human flourishing. Yet most of us go through life only dimly aware of the philosophical dimensions of our experience. We make decisions based on half-examined assumptions, or beliefs we never seriously question, and navigate ethical dilemmas without access to the wisdom that could help us think more clearly and live more intentionally. It's as if we were trying to navigate a complex landscape without a map, when centuries of philosophical exploration have already charted much of the territory. This is why philosophy matters, not as an abstract academic discipline, but as a practical tool for living. Philosophy doesn't provide easy answers or quick fixes, but it offers something much more valuable. Frameworks for thinking clearly about complex questions, tools for examining our own beliefs and assumptions, and connection to a community of inquiry that spans all of human history. The philosophical life isn't about withdrawing from the world into abstract speculation. It's about engaging more deeply and thoughtfully with the world as you find it. It's about becoming more aware of the assumptions that guide your choices, more skilled at thinking through complex problems, and more connected to the rich tradition of human wisdom that can illuminate your path. Every great decision you make, every meaningful relationship you build, every moment of clarity about what really matters. This emerges from philosophical reflection, whether you recognize it or not. The question is that whether you're already engaged in philosophy, you are. The question is whether you go on to the philosophy well or badly, consciously or unconsciously, with the benefit of humanity's accumulative wisdom or in isolation from it. The invitation to read philosophy is really an invitation to become more fully yourself, to live with greater intentionality, wisdom, and understanding. It's an invitation to join the great conversation that has been going on since the humans first began to wonder about their existence and their place in the cosmos. And it's an invitation to discover that the questions that feel most personal and present to you are, in fact, universal human questions that connect you to every thinking person who has ever lived. Philosophy is everywhere because thinking is everywhere, questioning is everywhere, and the search for wisdom and meaning is everywhere. The only question is whether you want to do it well. Part 2. What philosophy actually is, dispelling myths. Let's demolish some persistent and damaging myths about philosophy right from the start. If you picture philosophy as a bunch of elderly professors with wild hair and thick glasses, sitting in ivory towers debating how many angels can dance and head a pin while the real world burns around them, I have excellent news for you. That caricature couldn't be further from the truth. This misconception has probably done more to discourage people from engaging with philosophy than any other single factor, and it's time we put to rest once and for all. The myth of philosophy as a relevant abstraction is not just wrong, it's almost perfectly backwards. Philosophy is the most practical discipline imaginable because it deals with the fundamental questions that underlie every other human endeavor. Before you can have science, you need to ask what knowledge is and how we can obtain it. Before you can have politics, you need to examine what justice means and how societies should be organized. Before you can have ethics in medicine, business, or technology, you need to think carefully about what makes actions right or wrong. Philosophy doesn't avoid the real world. It investigates the conceptual foundations that make all other forms of inquiry possible. Consider what philosophy actually encompasses. Epistemology asks how we can know anything at all, a question that's absolutely crucial in our age of information overload, fake news, and competing truth claims. When you're trying to figure out whether to trust a news source, when you're evaluating scientific claims, or when you're deciding what to believe about complex issues, you're doing epistemology. Metaphysics investigates the nature of reality itself, what exists, how things relate to each other, and what it means for something to be real. In an era of virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and quantum physics, these questions are more pressing than ever. Ethics, perhaps the most obviously practical branch of philosophy, examines how we should live and what we owe to one another. Every moral dilemma you face, every question about right and wrong, every struggle with competing values draws on ethical philosophy. Political philosophy explores questions of justice, freedom, equality, and legitimate authority. Issues are front and center in every election, every policy debate, and every social movement. Aesthetics investigates the nature of beauty, art, and meaningful experience. Questions that shape how we design our cities, create our entertainment, and find meaning in life. But philosophy isn't just relevant to these big, abstract questions. It's intimately connected to the most concrete and practical challenges of contemporary life. Bioethics, a thriving field of applied philosophy, grapples with end-of-life care, genetic engineering, organ transplantation, and medical research. Business ethics examines corporate responsibility, fair labor practices, and the ethics of capitalism. Environmental philosophy investigates our moral obligations to nature and future generations. Computer ethics explores questions of privacy, artificial intelligence, and the social impact of technology. Philosophy is so practical that it has become indispensable in many professional fields. Hospitals employ philosophers to help with complex ethical decisions about patient care. Technology companies hire philosophers to think through the implications of artificial intelligence, data privacy, and algorithmic bias. Government agencies consult philosophers about policy decisions that involve competing values and uncertain consequences. The military employs philosophers to examine the ethics of warfare and the treatment of prisoners. Even businesses are discovering that philosophical training in critical thinking, ethical reasoning, and clear communication gives their employees significant advantages in problem-solving and decision-making. This practical relevance isn't a recent development. It has always been central to philosophical inquiry. The ancient Stoic philosophers developed their theories not as abstract intellectual exercises, but as practical guides for living well in challenging circumstances. Marcus Aurelius wrote his Meditations not for publication, but as personal reminders about how to stay grounded and ethical while dealing with the enormous pressures of governing an empire. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics was designed as a practical manual for achieving human flourishing. Confucius developed his philosophical system to address the concrete political and social problems of his time. The myth of philosophical relevance is often accompanied by another misconception, that philosophy is impossibly difficult and accessible only to intellectual elites. This belief keeps many people from even attempting to engage with philosophical ideas, which is unfortunate because it's largely false. While some philosophical works are indeed technically complex and require significant background knowledge, many of the most important philosophical insights are surprisingly accessible and can be grasped by anyone willing to think carefully about fundamental questions. The appearance of difficulty in philosophy often stems from the precision with which philosophers use language. Where everyday conversation might use words loosely or ambiguously, philosophers strive for clarity and exactness. They make distinctions that might seem unnecessarily subtle, but that turn out to be crucial for clear thinking. When a philosopher spends several pages defining what they mean by justice or knowledge or consciousness, they're not being pedantic. They're doing essential work of making sure we're all talking about the same thing. This precision can initially seem daunting, but it's actually what makes philosophical discussions so productive and illuminating. Another source of apparent difficulty is that philosophy asks us to question assumptions we normally take for granted. It can be disorienting to have someone challenge ideas that seem obviously true, or to be asked to justify beliefs you've never thought to examine. But this disorientation is often the beginning of genuine understanding. When Socrates claimed that the unexamined life is not worth living, he wasn't suggesting that life without philosophical reflection is literally worthless. He was pointing out that without examining our beliefs and assumptions, we're living on autopilot, guided by ideas we've never consciously chosen. Philosophy can also seem difficult because it deals with questions that don't have simple, definitive answers. In mathematics, you can prove that 2 + 2 = 4. In history, you can establish that World War II ended in 1945. But philosophical questions like what makes a life meaningful, or how should we distribute society's resources, don't admit of such clear-cut solutions. This doesn't mean that all answers are equally good or that philosophical inquiry is futile. It means that these questions require ongoing reflection, discussion, and refinement of our thinking. The myth that philosophy is uselessly abstract is often paired with the assumption that it's politically or ideologically uniform. People sometimes imagine that all philosophers share the same views, or that philosophy promotes a particular political agenda. In reality, philosophical inquiry leads to a remarkable diversity of conclusions. There are conservative philosophers and liberal philosophers, religious philosophers and atheist philosophers, optimistic philosophers and pessimistic philosophers. What unites them isn't a shared set of beliefs, but commitment to rigorous thinking, careful argumentation, and honest inquiry into fundamental questions. This diversity is actually one of philosophy's greatest strengths. Because philosophers come from different backgrounds and approach questions from different angles, philosophical discourse constantly challenges and refines ideas. Bad arguments get exposed, weak theories get strengthened or abandoned, and our collective understanding gradually improves. The fact that philosophers disagree doesn't undermine philosophy. It's evidence that the discipline is working as intended, subjecting ideas to rigorous scrutiny and debate. Perhaps the most damaging myth about philosophy is that it's a purely academic exercise with no connection to ordinary life. This misconception probably arises from the fact that much philosophical work is indeed carried out in universities, and academic philosophers do engage with technical questions that can seem removed from everyday concerns. But academic philosophy is just one manifestation of a much broader human impulse to understand ourselves and our world. The same questions that occupy professional philosophers are the ones that keep ordinary people awake at night. What's the point of life? How should I treat other people? What do I really know? How should I face death? The academic study of philosophy is valuable precisely because it brings systematic rigor to the questions that everyone faces. When professional philosophers spend years studying the nature of justice, they're not engaging in mere academic gamesmanship. They're developing tools and insights that can help all of us think more clearly about fairness, rights, and social organization. When they investigate the nature of consciousness, they're not indulging in abstract speculation. They're grappling with questions that have profound implications for how we understand ourselves, treat mental illness, and develop artificial intelligence. Modern philosophy is also increasingly engaged with empirical research and real-world applications. Experimental philosophers conduct studies to understand how people actually think about moral and conceptual questions. Philosophers of science work closely with practicing scientists to understand the implications of new discoveries. Applied ethicists collaborate with professionals in medicine, business, and technology to address concrete ethical challenges. This interdisciplinary engagement has enriched both philosophy and the field it engages with, leading to more sophisticated and nuanced approaches to complex problems. The reality is that philosophy is everywhere because thinking is everywhere. Every time you try to reason through a difficult decision, every time you question a commonly accepted belief, every time you try to understand what makes something beautiful or meaningful or just you're doing philosophy. The only difference between this everyday philosophical thinking and academic philosophy is that the latter is more systematic, more rigorous, and more informed by the long history of human reflection on these questions. Understanding what philosophy actually is, a systematic inquiry into fundamental questions using rigorous methods of analysis and argument, is the first step toward appreciating its value. Philosophy isn't about memorizing the opinions of dead Greeks, though understanding their insights can be helpful. It's not about winning debates with clever wordplay, though clear communication is important. And it's certainly not about retreating from practical concerns into abstract speculation. Philosophy is about learning to think more clearly, question more productively, and live more intentionally. It's about developing the intellectual tools you need to navigate a complex world filled with competing claims, conflicting values, and difficult decisions. It's about connecting with a tradition of human wisdom that can illuminate your path without dictating your choices. Most importantly, philosophy is about recognizing that the questions you face in your own life, questions about meaning, morality, knowledge, beauty, justice, and human nature, are not unique to you but are part of the shared human condition. By engaging with philosophy, you join a conversation that spans cultures and centuries, a conversation aimed at understanding what it means to be human and how we might live well together in this strange and wonderful world. Part 3, the practical benefits, sharper thinking. If you've ever wondered why some people seem naturally better at seeing through misleading arguments, spotting hidden assumptions, or making clear-headed decisions under pressure, the answer often lies in their exposure to philosophical thinking. Philosophy is mental training of the most rigorous kind, not the memorization of facts or the mastery of techniques, but the development of fundamental cognitive skills that transfer to virtually every area of life. It's like cross-training for your brain, where the strength and agility you develop in one domain enhance your performance across all others. The most immediate and practical benefit of philosophical study is the development of critical thinking skills. But what does this really mean? Critical thinking isn't just being skeptical or argumentative. It's the ability to analyze information systematically, identify underlying assumptions, recognize logical patterns, and evaluate the strength of evidence. These skills are essential in our information-saturated age, where we're constantly bombarded with claims, arguments, and supposed facts from countless sources. Consider how philosophy trains you to identify and analyze arguments. In everyday life, we're surrounded by attempts to persuade us, advertisements trying to sell us products, politicians seeking our votes, friends offering advice, experts making claims about health or finance or relationships. Philosophy teaches you to dissect these persuasive attempts systematically. You learn to identify the conclusion someone wants you to accept, the premises they're using to support that conclusion, and the logical steps that connect premises to conclusion. More importantly, you learn to ask crucial questions. Are the premises actually true? Does the conclusion really follow from the premises? What assumptions are being made that aren't explicitly stated? This analytical skill becomes invaluable in professional settings. When a colleague proposes a new strategy, when your boss presents quarterly results, or when you're evaluating a potential investment, philosophical training helps you cut through the rhetoric and focus on the substance. You become skilled at asking the right questions. What evidence supports this claim? What are the potential counterarguments? What are we assuming that might not be true? How confident should we be in this conclusion? Philosophy also develops your ability to spot logical fallacies, common errors in reasoning that can make bad arguments appear convincing. Once you learn to recognize ad hominem attacks, false dichotomies, appeals to authority, slippery slope arguments, and other fallacious patterns, you'll be amazed at how often you encounter them in political discourse, marketing, and even casual conversation. This isn't about becoming argumentative or pedantic. It's about protecting yourself from manipulation and making better decisions based on sound reasoning rather than clever rhetoric. The precision that philosophy demands in the use of language translates into clearer communication in all areas of life. Philosophers are trained to define their terms carefully, to use words consistently, and to make their reasoning explicit. These habits carry over into professional writing, public speaking, and everyday conversation. You learn to say exactly what you mean, to anticipate misunderstandings, and to structure your thoughts in ways that others can easily follow. In a world where miscommunication causes endless problems, this clarity of expression is an enormous practical advantage. Perhaps even more valuable is the skill of intellectual humility that philosophy cultivates. The history of philosophy is filled with brilliant people discovering that ideas they thought were obviously true were actually questionable, incomplete, or false. This experience teaches you to hold your beliefs lightly, to be confident enough to act on your convictions, while remaining open to new evidence and arguments. In rapidly changing fields like technology, medicine, or business, this intellectual flexibility is essential. You learn to update your beliefs when presented with better evidence rather than clinging to outdated ideas out of pride or habit. Philosophy also trains you to think systematically about complex problems. Philosophical questions rarely have simple answers because they involve multiple variables, competing values, and unintended consequences. Learning to navigate this complexity, to hold multiple perspectives in mind simultaneously, to trace out the implications of different assumptions, to recognize trade-offs and unintended consequences, prepares you for the kind of sophisticated thinking that real-world problems demand. The benefits extend to creativity and innovation as well. Philosophy encourages you to question fundamental assumptions that others take for granted. This questioning mindset is essential for breakthrough thinking in any field. Many innovations come from someone asking, why do we do it this way? Or what the opposite were true? Or what are we assuming that might not be necessary? Philosophy makes this kind of assumption questioning habitual. Research consistently demonstrates the practical value of philosophical training. Students who study philosophy consistently score among the highest on standardized tests like the LSAT, GMAT, and GRE. They outperform students in most other majors on these tests not because they've memorized more facts, but because they've developed superior analytical and reasoning skills. Philosophy majors also perform well in graduate school across a wide range of disciplines and are highly sought after by employers who value critical thinking, clear communication, and ethical reasoning. But the benefits go beyond test scores and career prospects. Philosophy develops what we might call metacognitive skills, the ability to think about thinking itself. You become more aware of your own thought processes, more skilled at recognizing your biases and blind spots, and more capable of deliberately choosing how to approach different types of problems. This self-awareness is invaluable for personal growth and effective decision-making. Consider how philosophical training affects your relationship with information and expertise. In our complex world, we must constantly decide whom to trust and what to believe about topics we can't personally investigate in depth. Should you trust this medical study? Is this financial advisor giving you good advice? How should you evaluate competing claims about climate change, economic policy, or child rearing? Philosophy doesn't make you an expert in all these fields, but it gives you the tools to evaluate expertise itself, to distinguish between reliable and unreliable sources, to recognize when experts disagree and why, and to maintain appropriate skepticism without falling into cynicism or conspiracy thinking. Philosophy also enhances your ability to engage constructively with people who disagree with you. One of the most important skills you learn in philosophical discussion is stillmaning, the practice of presenting opposing arguments in their strongest possible form before critiquing them. This is the opposite of strawmanning, where you attack a weak or distorted version of someone's position. Stillmaning requires you to really understand what your opponents are saying, to find the kernel of truth or reasonableness in their position, and to engage with their best arguments rather than their worst ones. This skill transforms your personal and professional relationships. Instead of talking past each other in heated debates, you learn to find common ground and genuine points of disagreement. You become better at changing people's minds because you show that you understand and respect their position before offering alternatives. You also become more open to having your own mind change because you're engaged in genuine dialogue rather than mere advocacy for predetermined positions. The problem-solving skills that philosophy develops are particularly valuable in leadership roles. Philosophical training teaches you to approach complex problems systematically, to break them down into component parts, to identify the key questions that need to be answered, to consider multiple perspectives and competing values, and to think to the long-term consequences of different solutions. You learn to lead discussions that are productive rather than merely argumentative, to help groups work through disagreements constructively, and to make decisions that take into account both practical constraints and ethical considerations. Philosophy also develops your capacity for what psychologists call perspective taking, the ability to understand how a situation looks from different viewpoints. This skill is essential for effective management, successful negotiation, and healthy relationships. When you can genuinely understand why different stakeholders see an issue differently, you're much better positioned to find solutions that work for everyone involved. The analytical skills that philosophy develops also make you a more sophisticated consumer of information. You become better at reading between the lines, at recognizing what's being emphasized and what's being downplayed, at identifying the underlying assumptions and potential conflict of interest that shape how information is presented. This doesn't make you cynical or paranoid. It makes you appropriately cautious and discriminating in your information consumption. Perhaps most importantly, philosophy develops your tolerance for uncertainty and complexity. Many of the most important decisions in life involve incomplete information, competing values, and unforeseeable consequences. Philosophy teaches you to act thoughtfully in the face of uncertainty rather than either paralyzed by indecision or rushing to premature conclusions. You learn to make the best decisions you can with the information available, while remaining alert to new evidence that might require you to change course. The cumulative effect of all these cognitive skills is profound. You become a more effective problem solver, a clearer communicator, a better decision maker, and a more thoughtful participant in democratic society. You're less susceptible to manipulation, more capable of independent thinking, and better equipped to navigate the complex challenges that characterize modern life. These aren't abstract or theoretical benefits. They're practical advantages that show up in your career, your relationships, and your personal life. They're skills that compound over time, becoming more valuable as you face increasingly complex challenges and responsibilities. And they're skills that no one can take away from you. Unlike technical knowledge that might become obsolete or professional credentials that might lose their value, the thinking skills that philosophy develops remain useful regardless of how the world changes around you. The beauty of philosophical training is that it makes you better at thinking about everything, not just philosophical questions. Whether you're evaluating a business proposal, working through a relationship conflict, trying to understand a scientific discovery, or simply try to figure out how to spend your weekend, the cognitive skills that philosophy develops enhance your ability to think clearly, communicate effectively, and make wise decisions. This is why philosophy has been called the mother of all sciences and the queen of disciplines. Not because it's more important than other fields of study, but because it develops the fundamental thinking skills that make excellence in all other fields possible. Part 4. The personal benefits, living more intentionally. While philosophy sharpens your thinking skills and makes you more effective in the world, its most profound impact may be on your inner life, your relationship with yourself, your understanding of what matters, and your capacity to live with purpose and intentionality. Philosophy doesn't just make you smarter. It makes you more thoughtful about the fundamental question that underlies all others. How should I live? This question might seem abstract, but it's intensely practical. Every day, you make countless choices about how to spend your time, energy, and attention. You decide what to prioritize, what to value, what to pursue, and what to let go. These decisions, accumulated over time, shape the trajectory of your life. Most people make these choices somewhat randomly, guided by immediate desires, social pressures, or unconscious habits. Philosophy offers something different. The tools to make these choices deliberately, based on careful reflection about what truly matters. Consider how philosophical reflection can transform your relationship with success and failure. Our culture tends to define success narrowly, in terms of wealth, status, recognition, or achievement. But philosophical traditions offer much richer and more nuanced ways of thinking about what makes a life successful. The ancient Stoics, for instance, distinguish between what is up to us and what is not up to us. According to Stoic philosophy, external goods like wealth, fame, or even health are not fully under our control, and therefore shouldn't be the primary basis for our happiness or self-worth. What is up to us is our character, our choices, our responses to circumstances, and our commitment to virtue. This Stoic insight can be revolutionary for how you handle setbacks and disappointments. Instead of measuring your worth by external outcomes that you can only partially influence, you learn to focus on internal goods that you can fully control. Did you act with integrity? Did you give your best effort? Did you treat others with kindness and respect? Did you learn from your mistakes? These become the real measures of success, and by these standards, you can succeed even when external circumstances don't go your way. Aristotelian virtue ethics offers another powerful framework for thinking about how to live. Aristotle argued that human flourishing, what he called eudaimonia, comes not from pursuing pleasure or avoiding pain, but from developing excellent character traits and using them to engage meaningfully with the world. Virtues like courage, honesty, generosity, and wisdom aren't just nice ideals. They're practical capacities that enable you to respond effectively to life's challenges and to contribute positively to your community. This virtue-based approach to life has practical implications for everyday decisions. When facing a difficult choice, instead of just asking what will make me happy or what will benefit me most, you can ask, what would a courageous person do? Or how can I respond to the situation with wisdom and integrity? These questions often point toward more fulfilling and sustainable choices than those based purely on immediate self-interest. Buddhist philosophy contributes another dimension to intentional living through its insights about suffering, attachment, and mindfulness. The Buddhist understanding that suffering often comes from our desperate clinging to things, people, and experiences that are inherently impermanent can help you develop a healthier relationship with loss and change. This doesn't mean becoming passive or uncaring, but rather learning to engage fully with life while holding outcomes lightly. The practice of mindfulness, rooted in Buddhist tradition but now supported by extensive psychological research, exemplifies how ancient philosophical wisdom can enhance modern life. When you cultivate mindful awareness, you become more conscious of your thoughts, emotions, and reactions as they arise. This awareness creates space between stimulus and response, space where choice becomes possible. Instead of automatically reacting based on habit or impulse, you can pause, reflect, and choose how to respond in ways that align with your values and long-term well-being. Existentialist philosophy offers yet another valuable perspective on intentional living through its emphasis on freedom, responsibility, and authenticity. Existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir argued that humans are fundamentally free to create meaning and purpose in their lives, but that this freedom comes with a full weight of responsibility for our choices. There is no predetermined essence or purpose that dictates how you should live. You must choose for yourself, and you are fully responsible for the consequences of those choices. This existentialist insight can be both liberating and daunting. It's liberating because it means you're not trapped by your past, your circumstances, or other people's expectations. You have a freedom to reinvent yourself, to choose new values, to pursue new goals. But it's also daunting because it means you can't blame others for your choices or hide behind external authorities. You must take full ownership of your life and the direction you choose to take it. The existentialist emphasis on authenticity is particularly relevant in our age of social media and social comparison. Authenticity, in the existentialist sense, doesn't mean being yourself in some fixed way. It means taking responsibility for choosing who you want to become and then living in accordance with that choice, regardless of social pressures or expectations. It means being honest about your own values, desires, and commitments rather than simply adopting those that are fashionable or socially rewarded. Philosophy also provides frameworks for thinking about relationships and community that can enrich your connections with others. Aristotle's analysis of friendship, for example, distinguishes between 3 types of relationships: friendships of utility, based on mutual benefit, friendships of pleasure, based on enjoyment, and friendships of virtue, based on mutual respect for each other's character and shared commitment to good living. Understanding these distinctions can help you appreciate different relationships for what they are and invest appropriately in those that have the potential for deeper connection. Kant's moral philosophy, with its emphasis on treating people as ends in themselves rather than merely as means, offers guidance for ethical relationships in both personal and professional contexts. This principle encourages you to consider the dignity and autonomy of others in all your interactions, to avoid manipulation, to respect others' capacity for moral reasoning, and to consider how your actions affect their ability to pursue their own legitimate goals. Care ethics, developed primarily by feminist philosophers like Nell Noddings and Carol Gilligan, emphasizes the moral significance of relationships, interdependence, and attentiveness to particular needs and contexts. This perspective balances the emphasis on universal principles found in other ethical traditions with recognition that moral life is always lived in particular relationships and communities where context matters enormously. These philosophical frameworks don't provide simple formulas for living, but they offer sophisticated tools for reflection that can help you navigate complex personal decisions. When you're struggling with work-life balance, when you're trying to decide whether to end a relationship, when you're facing a choice between competing opportunities, or when you're wondering how to respond to someone who has hurt you, philosophical reflection can help you think through these challenges more clearly and make choices that align with your deepest values. Philosophy also provides resources for dealing with some of life's most difficult experiences: mortality, suffering, loss, and uncertainty. Every philosophical tradition has grappled with these universal human challenges. developing insights that can help you face them with greater wisdom and resilience. The Stoic approach to mortality, for instance, emphasizes acceptance of death as a natural part of life, combined with commitment to living virtuously while we have the opportunity. Marcus Aurelius regularly reminded himself of life's brevity, not to become morbid, but to maintain perspective on what truly matters and to avoid wasting time on trivial pursuits. This memento mori practice can help you prioritize more effectively and appreciate the time you have. Buddhist perspectives on suffering and impermanence offer tools for accepting difficult experiences without being overwhelmed by them. The understanding that pain is inevitable, but suffering, our mental resistance to pain, is optional can help you navigate physical illness, emotional heartbreak, and life transitions with greater equanimity. Existentialist approaches to anxiety and uncertainty emphasize that these feelings are not necessarily problems to be solved, but maybe natural responses to human condition of freedom and responsibility. Learning to tolerate uncertainty and anxiety without being paralyzed by them is essential for living authentically in a complex and unpredictable world. Philosophy also enriches your capacity for self-reflection and personal growth. The Socratic method of questioning, constantly asking, what do I really know? And why do I believe what I believe? Can help you develop greater self-awareness and identify areas where your thinking might be confused or contradictory. This kind of philosophical self-examination can be uncomfortable, but it's also liberating because it frees you from unexamined assumptions and unconscious biases that might be limiting your growth. The practice of philosophical journaling, inspired by Marcus Aurelius's meditations but adaptable to contemporary life, provides a structured way to engage in regular self-reflection. By writing about your experiences through a philosophical lens, examining your reactions, questioning your assumptions, and considering how philosophical principles might apply to your circumstances, you develop greater clarity about your values, goals, and patterns of thinking. Perhaps most importantly, philosophy cultivates what we might call existential resilience, the ability to find meaning and purpose even in difficult circumstances. Viktor Frankl's experiences in Nazi concentration camps led him to conclude that humans can endure almost any suffering if they can find meaning in it. While few of us will face such extreme circumstances, all of us will encounter periods of loss, disappointment, and uncertainty where our ability to find meaning and maintain hope becomes crucial. Philosophical reflection does eliminate life's challenges, but provides tools for engaging with them more thoughtfully and constructively. Instead of being at the mercy of circumstances, emotions, or social pressures, you develop a capacity to step back, reflect, and choose your responses based on your deepest values and commitments. The cumulative effect of this kind of philosophical reflection is a life lived with greater intentionality, coherence, and meaning. You become more aware of why you make the choices you make, more confident in your ability to navigate difficult decisions, and more resilient in the face of setbacks. You develop a clearer sense of what matters most to you and greater skill at aligning your actions with your values. This doesn't mean that philosophical reflection makes life easy or eliminates uncertainty and conflict. If anything, it might make you more aware of life's complexities and the difficulty of many moral and existential questions. But it provides you with better tools for navigating these complexities and a deeper sense of agency in shaping your own life. The philosophers throughout history who developed these insights weren't academic theorists removed from practical concerns. They were people facing the same fundamental human challenges we all face: how to live meaningfully, how to relate ethically to others, how to deal with suffering and uncertainty, how to find purpose and direction. Their reflections, tested by their own lived experience and refined through centuries of dialogue and debate, offer wisdom that remains remarkably relevant to contemporary life. Engaging with this wisdom doesn't require you to adopt any particular philosophical system wholesale, but rather to use these various perspectives as tools for your own reflection and growth. The goal isn't to find the one true philosophy of life, but to develop your own capacity for thoughtful, intentional living informed by the best insights humanity has developed about how to flourish as human beings. Part 5: The Social Benefits, Better Conversations, and Citizenship. In our polarized and fragmented world, philosophy offers something increasingly rare and precious: the tools for genuine dialogue across difference. While our public discourse often devolves into tribal warfare where the goal is to defeat opponents rather than understand them, philosophical training cultivates a fundamentally different approach to disagreement, one based on curiosity rather than conquest, understanding rather than victory, and collaborative truth-seeking rather than competitive point-scoring. The social benefits of philosophical thinking begin with the simple but revolutionary practice of charitable interpretation. When you encounter an opinion that conflicts with your own, your first instinct might be to find fault with it, to identify its weaknesses, or to dismiss it as obviously wrong. Philosophy teaches you to do something counterintuitive, to interpret the opposing view in its strongest possible form before evaluating it. This practice, sometimes called steelmaning, requires you to work harder to understand what others are actually saying rather than attacking a caricature of their position. This shift in approach transforms the entire dynamic of disagreement. Instead of adversaries trying to defeat each other, you become collaborators trying to understand a complex issue together. Instead of talking past each other, you engage with the real substance of different perspectives. Instead of winning or losing arguments, you explore ideas together in ways that can lead to mutual learning and genuine insight. Consider how this plays out in practice. When someone argues for a political position you disagree with, philosophical training encourages you to ask, what valid concerns might be motivating this view? What evidence are they drawing on? What values are they prioritizing? What assumptions are they making that might be reasonable given their experience and knowledge? This doesn't mean you have to agree with conclusions you find problematic, but it means you engage with the reason behind those conclusions rather than simply dismissing them. This charitable approach to interpretation has profound effects on your relationships. People can sense when you're genuinely trying to understand them versus when you're just waiting for your turn to speak or looking for ammunition to use against them. When others feel truly heard and understood, they become more open to hearing your perspective in return. What could have been a frustrating debate becomes a productive conversation where both parties learn something. Philosophy also provides frameworks for thinking about different types of knowledge and different ways of approaching truth that can help bridge seemingly irreconcilable differences. Epistemology, the branch of philosophy concerned with knowledge, reveals that people might disagree not just about conclusions, but about fundamental questions like what count as evidence, how much certainty is required before accepting a claim, and whether some sources of knowledge are more reliable than others. Understanding these epistemological differences can help explain why intelligent, well-intentioned people can look at the same situation and reach opposite conclusions. Someone who prioritizes empirical evidence might reach different conclusions than someone who values traditional wisdom or personal experience. Someone who requires high levels of certainty before acting might make different choices than someone who is comfortable acting under uncertainty. These aren't necessarily right or wrong approaches. They're different ways of processing information and making decisions, each with their own strengths and limitations. This epistemological awareness makes you more humble about your own knowledge and more curious about how others arrive at their beliefs. Instead of assuming that anyone who disagrees with you must be ignorant, stupid, or malicious, you can explore the different assumptions, evidence, and reasoning processes that might lead reasonable people to different conclusions. Philosophy also enhances your ability to identify common ground, even amid apparent disagreement. Philosophical training teaches you to look for shared values, shared concerns, and shared goals that might underlie surface-level conflicts. Two people might disagree vehemently about specific policies, while sharing deeper commitments to human flourishing, fairness, or individual freedom. Identifying this common ground doesn't eliminate disagreement, but it provides a foundation for productive dialogue and collaborative problem-solving. The conversational skills that philosophy develops extend far beyond political or moral disagreements. In professional setting, philosophical training helps you facilitate meetings that are productive rather than merely argumentative, to help teams work through conflicts constructively, and to lead discussions that generate genuine insights rather than just recycling existing positions. You learn to ask the kind of questions that help groups think more clearly together. What assumptions are we making? What evidence would change our minds? What are the strongest arguments against our current approach? What values are we prioritizing? And are we being consistent about them? These skills are increasingly valuable in workplaces that require collaboration across diverse backgrounds, perspectives, and expertise areas. The ability to help different stakeholders understand each other, to find creative solutions that address multiple concerns, and to facilitate decision-making processes that everyone can support is highly sought after in leadership roles across all sectors. Philosophy also makes you a more interesting conversationalist in social settings. Instead of being limited to small talk about weather, celebrities, or local events, you find yourself having deeper conversations about meaning, purpose, ethics, and human nature. Philosophy provides a vast repository of ideas, thought experiments, and frameworks that can illuminate everyday experiences and transform mundane interactions into opportunities for insight and connection. When someone shares a personal struggle, philosophical knowledge might help you offer perspectives from Stoicism about resilience, from Buddhism about acceptance, or from existentialism about taking responsibility for your choices. When friends debate current events, you might contribute insights from political philosophy about justice, liberty, and social organization. When family members discuss life decisions, you might offer frameworks from ethics or practical wisdom traditions that can help them think more clearly about their choices. This doesn't mean becoming pedantic or constantly dropping philosophical names into conversation. The best philosophical contributions to everyday dialogue are often invisible. They show up as better questions, clearer thinking, and more thoughtful responses rather than as explicit references to philosophical theories or thinkers. Perhaps most importantly, philosophy cultivates the intellectual virtues necessary for democratic citizenship in a pluralistic society. Democracy depends on citizens who can think independently, evaluate evidence, engage respectfully with different viewpoints, and make informed decisions about complex issues. These are exactly the capacities that philosophical education develops. The ancient Athenians understood this connection between philosophy and democratic participation. They saw philosophical inquiry not as an abstract academic exercise, but as preparation for citizenship. The ability to think critically, to question authority, to evaluate competing claims, and to engage in reasoned debate with fellow citizens was considered essential for democratic self-governance. This connection remains just as important today. Our democratic institutions are under strain partly because too many citizens lack the intellectual skills and ethical commitments necessary for productive democratic participation. Too many people are susceptible to manipulation, unable to evaluate complex information, unwilling to consider alternative viewpoints, or incapable of changing their minds when presented with better evidence. Philosophical education provides an antidote to these democratic deficits. It develops citizens who are comfortable with complexity and uncertainty, skilled at evaluating different types of evidence, committed to following arguments where they lead rather than merely confirming existing beliefs, and capable of respectful engagement with those who hold different views. This doesn't mean that philosophical training eliminates political disagreement. If anything, it might make you more aware of the legitimate complexity of most political issues and more suspicious of simple solutions to complex problems. But it changes the quality of political disagreement, making it more thoughtful, more evidence-based, and more focused on solving problems and on defeating enemies. Philosophy also provides resources for thinking about social justice, human rights, and moral progress that can inform your engagement with contemporary social and political challenges. Whether you're thinking about economic inequality, racial justice, environmental protection, or global poverty, philosophical traditions offer sophisticated frameworks for analyzing these issues and evaluating potential responses. The social contract tradition helps you think about the legitimate role of government and the mutual obligations of citizens. Utilitarian approaches encourage you to consider the overall consequences of different policies for human well-being. Rights-based theories focus attention on fundamental human dignities that must be protected. Virtue ethics emphasizes the character traits and institutional practices that support human flourishing. These different philosophical approaches often lead to different policy conclusions, but they all provide more sophisticated tools for thinking about social and political issues than the simplistic ideological frameworks that dominate much public discourse. They encourage you to consider multiple perspectives, to think about unintended consequences, to weigh competing values, and to evaluate trade-offs honestly. Philosophy also helps you navigate the ethical dimensions of contemporary technological and social changes. As artificial intelligence transforms the economy, as social media reshapes human communication, as biotechnology raises new questions about human enhancement and genetic modification, philosophical reflection becomes essential for thinking through the implications of these changes for human flourishing, social justice, and individual freedom. The ability to think ethically about new technologies and social arrangements isn't just important for policymakers and technology developers. It's essential for all citizens who will be affected by these changes and who will participate in democratic decisions about how to regulate and direct them. Beyond these specific applications, philosophy cultivates what we might call social wisdom, the capacity to navigate complex social situations with insight, empathy, and ethical sensitivity. This shows up in your ability to build bridges across differences, to help resolve conflicts constructively, to contribute to communities in meaningful ways, and to be the kind of person others turn when they need thoughtful advice or moral support. The ancient Greeks had a concept called phronesis, practical wisdom or prudence, that captures the social dimension of philosophical thinking. Phronesis is the ability to deliberate well about human affairs, to make good judgments in particular situations, and act effectively for human flourishing. It's not just intellectual brilliance or technical expertise, but the kind of wisdom that helps communities thrive and individuals live well together. This practical wisdom is developed through engagement with philosophical questions about ethics, politics, human nature, and social organization, but it's expressed through everyday actions, relationships, and choices. It's the wisdom that helps you know when to speak up and when to listen, when to compromise and when to stand firm, when to trust and when to be cautious, when to lead and when to follow. In our interconnected and rapidly changing world, this kind of social wisdom is more important than ever. The challenges we face, from climate change and technological disruption to global inequality, require collective action based on shared understanding and mutual respect. They require citizens who can think clearly about complex issues, communicate effectively across differences, and work together constructively despite disagreements. Philosophy provides the intellectual and ethical foundation for this kind of constructive social engagement. It develops the skills, virtues, and perspectives that make productive dialogue possible, even across significant differences in background, belief, and interest. It prepares you to be not just a better individual, but a better member of a human community. Part 6, Where to Start, the Beginner's Roadmap. The biggest obstacle most people face when they decide to explore philosophy isn't lack of interest or intelligence. It's simply not knowing where to begin. The philosophical tradition spans over 2,000 years, encompasses dozens of major thinkers and hundreds of important works, and covers virtually every aspect of human experience. Faced with this vastness, many potential readers feel overwhelmed and either never start or begin with texts that are too advanced or obscure for productive engagement. The secret to successful philosophical reading is starting with the right texts, works that are accessible to beginners while still containing genuine philosophical depth and insight. You want authors who write clearly about universal themes, who engage with fundamental questions that matter to your life, and who provide entry points into broader philosophical conversations without requiring extensive background knowledge. The ancient world provides several excellent starting points, beginning with Marcus Aurelius and his Meditations. This text is ideal for beginners because it wasn't originally intended for publication. It's the private journal of a Roman emperor reflecting on how to live well while facing enormous practical challenges. The entries are short, personal, and immediately relevant to anyone dealing with stress, difficult people, setbacks, or questions about how to maintain integrity under pressure. Marcus Aurelius writes with a directness and practicality that makes Stoic philosophy accessible without dumbing it down, when he reminds himself that you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. He's articulating a profound philosophical principle about the nature of human agency and the sources of psychological resilience. When he reflects on the inevitability of change and loss, he's engaging with fundamental metaphysical questions about the nature of reality and our place within it. What makes Meditations particularly valuable for beginners is that it demonstrates philosophy as a lived practice rather than an abstract intellectual exercise. You see how philosophical principles can be applied to real-world situations, how they can provide comfort and guidance during difficult times, and how they can help someone think more clearly about what matters most in life. From Marcus Aurelius, a natural next step is Plato's dialogues, particularly the Apology, which recounts Socrates' trial and defense of his philosophical life. This text is engaging because it reads like a courtroom drama, but also introduces fundamental questions about the value of philosophical inquiry. the relationship between wisdom and ignorance, and the costs and benefits of living an examined life. The Apology is followed naturally by Crito, which explores Socrates' reason for accepting his death sentence rather than escaping from prison. Together, these dialogues provide a compelling portrait of philosophical integrity and introduce key questions about moral obligation, civil disobedience, and the relationship between individual conscience and social authority. For readers ready for something more substantial, Plato's Republic contains some of the most influential ideas in Western philosophy, but it's long and complex. A better approach might be to start with the famous Allegory of the Cave from Book 7, which can be read on its own and provide a vivid introduction to Plato's ideas about knowledge, reality, and education. This allegory is particularly relevant in our age of information overload and competing truth claims, offering a framework for thinking about how we can distinguish between genuine knowledge and mere opinion or propaganda. Aristotle presents more challenges for beginners because his writing style is more technical and systematic than Plato's dialogues or Marcus Aurelius's reflections. However, his Nicomachean Ethics contains insights about happiness, character, and human flourishing that remain remarkably relevant to contemporary life. Rather than reading the entire work, beginners might focus on books 1, 2, and X, which cover Aristotle's account of happiness, eudaimonia, his theory of moral virtue, and his thoughts on the intellectual virtues and contemplative life. Aristotle's analysis of friendship in books 8 and 9 is also particularly rewarding for contemporary readers. His distinction between friendships of utility, pleasure, and virtue provides a framework for understanding different types of relationships and thinking about what makes for lasting and meaningful connections with others. Moving into the modern period, several philosophers wrote with particular clarity and accessibility for educated general readers. Bertrand Russell's The Problems of Philosophy was specifically written as an introduction to philosophical thinking for non-specialists. Russell addresses fundamental questions about knowledge, reality, and certainty in clear, straightforward prose, introducing readers to epistemological questions that remain central to philosophy while avoiding unnecessary technical jargon. John Stuart Mill's On Liberty is another excellent entry point into modern philosophy. Mill's arguments about individual freedom, the limits of social authority, and the importance of diverse opinions and lifestyles speak directly to contemporary debates about free speech, social conformity, and the proper relationship between individual liberty and social harmony. The text is clearly written and deals with issues that matter to anyone living in a democratic society. For readers interested in American philosophy, William James's Pragmatism offers an accessible introduction to a distinctly American approach to philosophical questions. James writes with clarity and humor about how philosophical ideas can be tested by their practical consequences, how different temperaments lead to different philosophical conclusions, and how we can navigate between dogmatism and skepticism in our beliefs. Contemporary philosophers have produced several excellent works designed specifically for general readers who want to engage with philosophical ideas without getting lost in academic technicalities. Thomas Nagel's What Does It All Mean is a brief introduction to major philosophical problems written in clear, non-technical language. Nagel covers questions about knowledge, mind, free will, right and wrong, justice, and the meaning of life in less than 100 pages, providing readers with a survey of central philosophical questions and some of the main approaches to answering them. Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein's Plato at the Googleplex takes a more creative approach, imagining how Plato might respond to contemporary situations and debates. This book makes ancient philosophy relevant to modern concerns while providing sophisticated analysis of Plato's ideas and their continuing significance. Goldstein's approach shows how classical philosophical questions remain alive and important in contemporary contexts. Michael Sandel's Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do, grows out his famous Harvard course on political philosophy. Sandel uses contemporary examples and thought experiments to introduce readers to major approaches to thinking about justice, rights, and moral obligation. The book is particularly valuable because it shows how abstract philosophical theories apply to concrete policy questions and moral dilemmas that citizens face in democratic societies. For readers interested in Eastern philosophy, several accessible introductions can provide entry points into Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian thought. The Dalai Lama's writings, particularly The Art of Happiness, present Buddhist philosophy informs accessible to Western readers without losing philosophical depth. Thich Nhat Hanh's works on mindfulness and engaged Buddhism similarly make profound philosophical ideas accessible through practical applications. The Tao Te Ching, attributed to Lao Tzu, is a brief text that introduces key concepts of Taoist philosophy through poetic verses that invite contemplation and reflection. Different translations vary significantly in accessibility and interpretation, so it's worth comparing several versions to find one that resonates with your reading style. For Confucian Thought to Analects, a collection of Confucius's sayings and conversations with disciples, provides insights into virtue ethics, social harmony, and personal cultivation that complement Western philosophical traditions while offering different perspectives on similar questions. When choosing where to start, consider your own interests and concerns. If you're dealing with stress and looking for frameworks for resilience, Marcus Aurelius might be ideal. If you're interested in political questions about justice and social organization, Mill's on Liberty or Sandel's Justice might be more engaging. If you're curious about consciousness and the nature of mind, Nagel's Introduction to Philosophical Problems might provide the best entry point. It's also worth considering different formats for philosophical engagement. Many classic texts are available as audiobooks, which can make them more accessible for busy readers or those who learn better through listening. Philosophy podcasts like Philosophy Talk or The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps provide another way to encounter philosophical ideas in digestible formats. Online resources can supplement your reading and help you engage with philosophical communities. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy provides reliable, scholarly articles on virtually every philosophical topic and thinker, written at a level accessible to educated general readers. University websites often make philosophy course materials freely available, including lecture notes, reading guides, and discussion questions that can enhance your understanding of texts you're reading independently. Don't feel pressured to read entire books immediately or to understand everything on first reading. Philosophy rewards slow, careful reading and rereading. Many readers find it helpful to read actively, taking notes, writing down questions, and pausing to think about how philosophical ideas relate to their own experience and beliefs. Consider joining or forming a philosophy discussion group, either in person or online. Philosophy is inherently dialogical. It develops through conversation and debate, and discussing texts with others often leads to insights that wouldn't emerge from solitary reading. Many communities have philosophy cafes or discussion groups that welcome beginners, and online forums provide opportunities to engage with philosophical ideas in community with others. Start with short sessions. Even 15 or 20 minutes of focused philosophical reading can be rewarding and sustainable. As you develop familiarity with philosophical thinking and vocabulary, you can gradually take on more challenging texts and longer reading sessions. Remember that the goal isn't to become an expert on any particular philosopher or philosophical system, but rather to develop your own capacity for philosophical thinking. Use these texts as tools for reflection on your own life and beliefs rather than authorities to be accepted uncritically. The best philosophical reading is active and personal. It engages your own experience and judgment rather than simply downloading someone else's conclusions. As you develop familiarity with philosophical thinking through these accessible entry points, you'll naturally discover areas and thinkers that particularly interest you. Some readers gravitate toward ethics and questions about how to live. Others are drawn to epistemology and questions about knowledge and truth. Still others find political philosophy or philosophy of mind most engaging. Follow your interests, but also challenge yourself occasionally to explore areas that initially seem less compelling. You might discover unexpected insights and connections. The philosophical journey is inherently personal and open-ended. There's no final destination, no point at which you'll have mastered philosophy, no single correct path through the tradition. The value lies in the ongoing process of reflection, questioning, and dialogue that philosophical engagement makes possible. Start wherever feels most natural and interesting, but do start. The conversation has been going on for over 2,000 years, and there's a place in it for your voice and your questions. Part 7. How to read philosophy effectively. Reading philosophy is fundamentally different from reading fiction, journalism, or even other forms of academic writing. You can't approach Aristotle the same way you approach a novel, or engage with Kant the same way you consume a news article. Philosophy demands active, engaged reading that treats the text as a conversation partner rather than a source of passive entertainment or simple information transfer. Learning to read philosophy effectively is a skill that develops over time, but understanding the right approach from the beginning can save you enormous frustration and make your philosophical journey far more rewarding. The first thing to understand about philosophical reading is that confusion is not a sign of failure. It's an integral part of the process. Even professional philosophers regularly encounter passages that puzzle them, arguments they need to work through slowly, and concepts that require multiple readings to grasp fully. If you find yourself confused by a philosophical text, you're not alone and you're not inadequate. You're having a normal philosophical experience. This means you need to approach philosophical reading with patience and persistence. Unlike a thriller novel that carries you along through narrative momentum or a news article that delivers information efficiently, philosophical texts require you to slow down, pause frequently, and think carefully about what you're reading. The goal isn't to get to the text quickly, but to understand it deeply. The most effective approach to philosophical reading is what we might call the 3-pass method. This technique recognizes that philosophical understanding develops in layers, with each reading revealing new dimensions of meaning and argument that weren't visible in earlier passes. Your first pass through a philosophical text should focus on getting the big picture. Don't worry about understanding every argument or grasping every nuance. Instead, try to identify the main question the philosopher is addressing, the general approach they're taking to that question, and the overall conclusion they reach. Think of this first reading as reconnaissance. You're surveying the territory to get a sense of the landscape before exploring it in detail. During this first pass, pay particular attention to the text structure. How does a philosopher organize their argument? Do they start with a problem or question and then work toward a solution? Do they examine and critique other views before presenting their own? Do they build their case through a series of logical steps? Or do they explore different aspects of the question from multiple angles? Understanding the overall architecture of the argument will help you navigate the details more effectively in subsequent readings. Also, during your first pass, make note of key terms and concepts that seem central to the philosopher's argument, even if you don't fully understand them yet. Philosophy involves careful attention to language, and philosophers often use familiar words in precise technical ways that differ from everyday usage. Terms like freedom, justice, knowledge, reality, and good might mean something quite specific in a philosophical context that's different from their ordinary meanings. Your second pass should focus on understanding the specific arguments and reasoning. Now that you have a sense of where the philosopher is going, you can pay closer attention to how they get there. Try to identify the key premises of their arguments, the starting points or assumptions they build upon. Look for the logical steps that connect these premises to their conclusions. Notice where they consider objections to their views and how they respond to those objections. During the second reading, it's helpful to take notes, but not just passive summaries of what the philosopher says. Instead, engage actively with the text by asking questions and noting your reactions. When you encounter a claim that seems questionable, write down why it seems problematic to you. When you see an argument that strikes you as particularly compelling, note what makes it convincing. When you find yourself confused by a particular passage, mark it for further attention and try to articulate specifically what you don't understand. This active note-taking serves multiple purposes. It helps you stay engaged with the text rather than reading passively. It creates a record of your thoughts and questions that you can return to later. And it begins the process of developing your own philosophical voice by encouraging you to respond to what you're reading rather than simply absorbing it. Your third pass should be evaluative and synthetic. Now that you understand what the philosopher is arguing and how they make their case, you can step back and assess the strength of their position. Do their arguments actually support their conclusions? Are their premises plausible? Have they considered the strongest objections to their view? How does their position relate to other philosophical views you've encountered? What are the practical implications of accepting their arguments? This third reading is where you begin to develop your own philosophical position in dialogue with the text. You're not just trying to understand what the philosopher thinks, but deciding what you think about what they think. This doesn't mean you have to agree or disagree completely. Philosophical positions are often more nuanced than simple acceptance or rejection. You might find some aspects of a philosopher's view compelling, while remaining skeptical about others. You might think they've identified an important problem without being fully convinced by their proposed solution. Throughout all three passes, pay special attention to philosophers' use of examples, thought experiments, and analogies. Philosophy often deals with abstract concepts and complex arguments that can be difficult to grasp in purely theoretical terms. Philosophers use concrete examples and imaginative scenarios to make their abstract points more accessible and to test the implications of their theories. When Plato uses the analogy of the cave to illustrate his theory of knowledge, when Kant asks us to imagine what would happen if everyone followed a particular moral principle, when John Rawls invites us to think about what principles of justice we would choose if we didn't know our place in society, they're using these devices to help us understand and evaluate complex philosophical ideas. Pay careful attention to these examples and consider whether they actually support the points the philosopher is trying to make. It's also crucial to understand that philosophical arguments are often cumulative and interconnected. A philosopher might introduce a concept early in a text and then build on it throughout their argument, gradually adding layers of complexity and nuance. Or they might present what initially seems like a minor point that becomes central to their overall position. This is why multiple readings are so important. Connections and implications that weren't apparent on first reading often become clear only after you've seen how all the pieces fit together. Don't hesitate to consult secondary sources when you're struggling with a difficult text, but use them strategically. Commentaries, study guides, and introductory books about particular philosophers can provide helpful context and clarification, but they shouldn't substitute for your own engagement with the primary text. Use secondary sources to help you understand what you're reading, not to tell you what to think about it. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is an excellent resource for reliable, scholarly articles about philosophical topics and thinkers. These articles are written by experts, but aimed at an educated general audience, and they often provide helpful summaries of complex arguments and useful bibliographies for further reading. Online philosophy communities can also be valuable resources for discussing difficult texts and getting different perspectives on challenging arguments. Platforms like Reddit's philosophy forums, specialized philosophy discussion sites, and even social media groups can provide opportunities to engage with other readers who are grappling with similar questions and texts. As you develop your philosophical reading skills, you'll begin to recognize common patterns and structures in philosophical arguments. You'll become more skilled at identifying premises and conclusions, at recognizing different types of arguments, and at spotting potential problems or objections. These pattern recognition skills make philosophical reading more efficient and enjoyable over time. You'll also develop what we might call philosophical patience, the ability to sit with uncertainty and complexity without rushing to premature closure. Some philosophical questions don't have clear answers, and some philosophical texts are deliberately open-ended or exploratory rather than conclusive. Learning to appreciate the value of the inquiry itself, even when it doesn't lead to definitive solutions, is an important part of philosophical maturity. Keep a philosophical journal or notebook where you can record not just summaries of what you've read, but your own thoughts, questions, and developing ideas. This practice serves several purposes. It helps you process and remember what you've read. It encourages you to engage actively with philosophical ideas and create a record of your intellectual development over time. In your journal, you might explore connections between different philosophers you've read, apply philosophical concepts to your own experience, work through arguments that you found particularly challenging, or develop your own thoughts on philosophical questions. This kind of writing is philosophical thinking in action, and it's often where the real insights emerge. Don't feel pressured to read entire books or complete works immediately. Many philosophical texts are dense and complex, and it's perfectly legitimate to read them in sections, taking breaks to digest what you've read before moving on. Some readers find it helpful to alternate between philosophical texts and lighter reading, or to read philosophy in shorter sessions rather than trying to tackle long passages at once. It's also worth experimenting with different approaches to see what works best for you. Some readers prefer to read silently, while others find that reading passages aloud helps them engage more actively with the text. Some people benefit from discussing what they're reading with others, while others prefer to work through texts on their own first before engaging in dialogue about them. Group reading can be particularly valuable for philosophical texts. Philosophy is inherently dialogical. It develops through conversation and debate, and reading philosophical texts with others often reveals interpretations and insights that wouldn't emerge from solitary reading. Consider joining or forming a philosophy reading group, either in person or online. When participating in philosophical discussions, whether in person or online, practice the same charitable interpretation that you should apply to your reading. Try to understand what others are saying before evaluating it. Ask clarifying questions when you're unsure about someone's position, and be open to having your own views challenged and refined through dialogue. Remember that philosophical reading is a skill that improves with practice. Your first attempt at reading philosophy might feel slow and difficult, but as you develop familiarity with philosophical vocabulary, argument styles, and ways of thinking, the process becomes more natural and enjoyable. Each text you read successfully prepares you for the next one. Most importantly, remember that the goal of philosophical reading isn't to master a body of information or to adopt someone else's views wholesale. The goal is to develop your own capacity for philosophical thinking, your ability to analyze arguments, question assumptions, consider multiple perspectives, and think carefully about fundamental questions. The texts you read are tools for developing these capacities, not authorities to be accepted uncritically. Approach each philosophical text as an opportunity for intellectual growth and self-discovery. Use the arguments and ideas you encounter as occasions for examining your own beliefs and assumptions. Let yourself be challenged, surprised, and sometimes confused. This is how philosophical understanding develops, and it's how philosophical reading becomes a transformative rather than merely informative experience. Part 8. Common obstacles and how to overcome them. Every person who has ever attempted to engage seriously with philosophy has encountered obstacles that make them want to give up. These barriers are so common and predictable that we can anticipate them and develop strategies for overcoming them. Understanding that these challenges are normal parts of the philosophical journey, rather than signs of personal inadequacy or evidence that philosophy isn't for you, is the first step toward pushing through them and discovering the rewards that lie on the other side. The most frequently cited obstacle is simply that philosophy is too hard. This complaint usually emerges after someone tries to read a challenging text like Kant's Critique of Pure Reason or Heidegger's Being and Time as their first philosophical work, or when they encounter technical philosophical vocabulary without adequate preparation. The frustration is understandable, but the conclusion that philosophy is inherently too difficult for ordinary people is mistaken. Philosophy can indeed be challenging, but this difficulty is not insurmountable, and it's certainly not a reason to avoid philosophical engagement altogether. The key is recognizing that philosophical difficulty comes in different forms and can be addressed through appropriate strategies. Some philosophical difficulty comes from technical vocabulary and complex arguments that require background knowledge to understand. Other philosophical difficulty comes from the inherent complexity of the questions being addressed. Questions that don't have simple answers because reality itself is complex and multifaceted. For the first type of difficulty, technical complexity, the solution is usually preparation and patience. Instead of jumping into the most challenging texts, start with accessible introductory works and gradually build your familiarity with philosophical concepts and argumentation styles. Use secondary sources like commentaries, study guides, and encyclopedia articles to provide context and clarification when you encounter unfamiliar terms or concepts. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is invaluable for this purpose. When you encounter a philosophical term or concept you don't understand, you can often find a clear, reliable explanation there that will help you understand not just the definition, but also the historical context and contemporary debates surrounding the concept. For the second type of difficulty, the inherent complexity of philosophical questions, the solution is developing comfort with uncertainty and ambiguity. Some philosophical questions are genuinely difficult because they deal with fundamental aspects of reality, knowledge, and value that don't admit of simple answers. Learning to appreciate this complexity, rather than being frustrated by it, is part of developing philosophical maturity. Remember that even professional philosophers disagree about most important philosophical questions. This disagreement isn't a sign that philosophy is failing or that the questions are meaningless. It's evidence that these questions are genuinely complex, and that thoughtful people can reasonably reach different conclusions based on careful consideration of the evidence and arguments. Another common obstacle is a perception that philosophy is boring or irrelevant to real life. This usually indicates that someone has started with the wrong texts or approached philosophy from an overly abstract perspective. Philosophy becomes boring when it's treated as a collection of historical curiosities or abstract theoretical exercises, rather than as a living tradition of inquiry into questions that matter for how we think and live. The solution to boredom is finding the right entry points, texts and topics that connect to your existing interests and concerns. If you're interested in questions about technology and society, start with contemporary work in ethics of technology rather than medieval scholastic philosophy. If you're dealing with stress and looking for frameworks for resilience, begin with Stoic philosophy rather than abstract metaphysics. If you're curious about social justice, explore political philosophy rather than logic or philosophy of language. Philosophy becomes engaging when you see its relevance to questions you're already thinking about. Once you develop appreciation for philosophical inquiry through topics that naturally interest you, you can gradually explore other areas of philosophy and discover connections and insights that weren't initially apparent. It's also worth remembering that different philosophical texts serve different purposes. Some are meant to provide practical guidance for living, others to develop rigorous arguments about abstract questions, still others to explore creative possibilities for thinking about familiar problems. If one type of philosophical writing doesn't engage you, try a different approach rather than concluding that philosophy as a whole is boring. A related obstacle is the belief that philosophy is impractical, that it deals with abstract questions that have no bearing on real-world concerns. This perception is almost entirely backwards. Philosophy is among the most practical disciplines because it examines the conceptual foundations that underlie all other human activities. Before you can have science, politics, ethics, or any other organized human endeavor, you need philosophical clarity about fundamental concepts and principles. The appearance of impracticality usually comes from encountering philosophy that's presented without sufficient connection to its practical applications. When you read about Aristotle's theory of virtue without seeing how it applies to character development and moral decision-making, or when you encounter epistemological arguments without understanding their relevance to questions about knowledge and evidence, philosophy can seem disconnected from practical concerns. The solution is actively looking for connections between philosophical ideas and real-world applications. When you read about a philosophical concept or argument, ask yourself, how might this apply to my own life? What practical implications does this have for how I think about important questions? How does this relate to contemporary debates and challenges? Many contemporary philosophers are explicitly engaged with practical applications of philosophical ideas. Applied ethics deals with concrete moral dilemmas in medicine, business, technology, and other fields. Political philosophy examines questions of justice, freedom, and social organization that are central to policy debates. Philosophy of mind connects to questions about artificial intelligence, mental health, and human consciousness that have enormous practical importance. The perception that philosophy lacks practical value often reflects unfamiliarity with these applied areas of philosophical work rather than an inherent limitation of philosophical inquiry itself. Time constraints represent another significant obstacle for many people who are interested in philosophical reading, but feel overwhelmed by competing demands on their attention. Modern life is busy, and philosophical texts can seem to require more sustained attention than many people feel they can spare. The solution to time constraints is finding sustainable approaches to philosophical engagement that fit your actual lifestyle rather than an idealized version of it. You don't need to read for hours at a time or complete entire books in short periods to benefit from philosophical engagement. Even 15 or 20 minutes of focused philosophical reading can be rewarding and cumulative in its effects. Consider integrating philosophical reading into existing routines. Listen to philosophy podcasts during commutes or while exercising. Read short philosophical texts or passages during lunch breaks or before bed. Use audiobook versions of philosophical texts to make use of time that might otherwise be unproductive. Philosophy is also well suited to intermittent engagement. Unlike narrative fiction, which benefits from continuous reading to maintain story momentum, philosophical texts can often be read profitably in short segments, with breaks for reflection and digestion between reading sessions. Some people worry that they lack the educational background necessary for philosophical reading. They assume that philosophy requires extensive training in logic, classical languages, or other specialized areas of knowledge that they never had the opportunity to develop. While some philosophical texts do require significant background knowledge, many important philosophical works are accessible to any educated reader willing to engage thoughtfully with fundamental questions. The history of philosophy includes many thinkers who wrote for general audiences and whose works remain accessible to contemporary readers without specialized training. Moreover, the most important qualification for philosophical reading isn't formal education, but intellectual curiosity and willingness to think carefully about important questions. Many of the deepest philosophical insights emerge from asking simple questions persistently and thinking through their implications carefully. This kind of thinking is available to anyone, regardless of their educational background. If you're concerned about lacking background knowledge, start with texts that are explicitly written for general audiences. Use introductory resources to provide context when needed, and don't hesitate to consult secondary sources for clarification and background information. Another obstacle that stops many people is perfectionism, the belief that they need to understand everything completely before moving on, or that they should be able to grasp complex arguments immediately. This perfectionist approach to philosophical reading is counterproductive because it sets unrealistic expectations that lead to frustration and abandonment. Philosophy is inherently difficult and often ambiguous. Even professional philosophers regularly encounter arguments they need to work through slowly, passages that puzzle them, and concepts that require multiple readings to grasp fully. Partial understanding is not failure. It's a normal and often productive stage in the process of philosophical learning. Allow yourself to move forward even when you don't understand everything completely. Mark passages that confuse you for later attention. But don't let confusion about particular points prevent you from engaging with the broader argument or text. Often, later portions of a text will clarify earlier confusions, or subsequent readings will reveal meanings that weren't apparent initially. Some readers are discouraged by the apparent disagreement and controversy that characterize much philosophical discourse. They wonder what the point is of engaging with questions that have been debated for centuries without reaching definitive resolution. This concern reflects a misunderstanding of what philosophical progress looks like. Philosophy doesn't progress by settling questions once and for all, but by developing more sophisticated ways of thinking about fundamental problems, by clarifying assumptions and implications of different positions, and by discovering new connections and possibilities that weren't previously apparent. The ongoing nature of philosophical debate is not a bug, but a feature. It reflects the genuine difficulty and importance of the questions being addressed. Questions about consciousness, free will, moral obligation, political justice, and the nature of knowledge are genuinely complex, and reasonable people can disagree about them based on different experiences, values, and ways of interpreting evidence. Your engagement with these debates contributes to your own intellectual development, even if it doesn't resolve the underlying questions definitively. Philosophy is valuable as a process of inquiry and reflection, not just as a source of final answers. Finally, some people worry that philosophical engagement will undermine their existing beliefs or create unwanted uncertainty about questions they previously felt confident about. This concern is understandable, but it reflects a misunderstanding of what philosophical growth involves. Philosophical inquiry does often challenge existing assumptions and beliefs, but this challenging process is typically productive rather than destructive. When philosophical reflection leads you to modify or abandon beliefs that can't withstand careful examination, you're replacing weaker beliefs with stronger ones, not losing something valuable. Moreover, philosophical maturity involves learning to hold beliefs with appropriate confidence, being more certain about well-supported beliefs and less certain about speculative or poorly grounded ones. This kind of intellectual humility is a strength, not a weakness, and it makes you less susceptible to dogmatism and more open to learning and growth. The key to overcoming all these obstacles is recognizing that they are normal parts of the philosophical journey rather than insurmountable barriers. Every philosopher and every serious reader of philosophy has encountered these challenges. The difference between those who continue and benefit from philosophical engagement and those who give up is often simply persistence and willingness to work through difficulties rather than being stopped by them. Start with manageable goals. Choose appropriate texts for your current level of preparation. Be patient with yourself when you encounter difficulties. And remember that the goal is intellectual growth and self-understanding rather than mastery of a fixed body of information. Philosophy is a lifelong journey, not a destination, and every step along the way offers opportunities for insight and development. Part 9. The call to action. Your philosophical journey begins. You now understand what philosophy is, why it matters, and how to engage with it effectively. You know that philosophy isn't abstract navel-gazing, but practical wisdom for living. You understand that it develops crucial cognitive skills while also providing frameworks for personal growth and social engagement. You have a roadmap for where to start and strategies for overcoming common obstacles. The question that remains is simple but profound. What will you do with this knowledge? The invitation before you is not merely to read about philosophy or to appreciate from a distance, but to begin practicing it, to start asking deeper questions, thinking more carefully about fundamental issues, and engaging with the wisdom tradition that spans cultures and centuries. This is an invitation to intellectual adventure, personal growth, and meaningful participation in humanity's ongoing conversation about how we should understand ourselves and our world. But let's be honest about what this invitation entails. Philosophical engagement is not a quick fix or an easy path to certainty and comfort. It won't eliminate the complexities and ambiguities of human existence, and it won't provide simple answers to difficult questions. What it offers is something more valuable: the tools to navigate complexity more skillfully, the wisdom to live more intentionally, and the intellectual courage to face uncertainty without being paralyzed by it. Philosophy has been called the love of wisdom, but perhaps it's more accurately described as the courage to question. In a world that offers endless easy answers, quick solutions, and comfortable certainties, philosophy asks you to do something more demanding, to think for yourself, to examine your assumptions, to consider alternative perspectives, and to live with appropriate humility about the limits of human knowledge. This courage to question is desperately needed in our contemporary world. We face challenges that require not just technical expertise, but wisdom. Climate change, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, global inequality, political polarization, and social media's effects on human psychology and democracy. These challenges can be addressed through simple ideological formulas or tribal loyalties. They require citizens who can think critically, communicate across differences, consider multiple perspectives, and make thoughtful decisions about complex issues. Your philosophical journey begins with a simple but significant step: choosing your first text and committing to engaging with it seriously. This might seem like a small action, but it represents something larger, a decision to prioritize understanding over mere opinion, wisdom over mere information, and long-term growth over immediate gratification. Here's your specific assignment. If you choose to accept it, select one book from the beginner's recommendations discussed earlier. It might be Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. If you're drawn to practical wisdom about resilience and character, it might be Plato's Apology. If you're curious about the nature and value of philosophical inquiry itself, it might be Thomas Nagel's What Does It All Mean? If you want a contemporary overview of major philosophical questions. Choose based on your interests and circumstances, but do choose something specific. Commit to reading just 10 pages per day from your chosen text. This is a manageable goal that won't overwhelm your schedule, but will provide steady progress and sustain engagement with philosophical ideas. 10 pages per day means you'll complete most philosophical books within a month or two, giving you time to digest and reflect on what you're reading without feeling rushed. Read actively, not passively. Keep a notebook or journal where you can record your thoughts, questions, and reactions to what you're reading. Don't just summarize a philosopher's arguments. Engage with them. Ask yourself, do I agree with this? Why or why not? How does this relate to my own experience? What questions does this raise for me? What would I say in response to this argument? This active engagement transforms reading from mere information consumption into genuine philosophical thinking. You're not just learning what other people have thought about important questions. You're developing your own capacity to think about these questions thoughtfully and systematically. Seek out others to discuss philosophical ideas with. Philosophy develops through dialogue and debate, and discussing texts with others often reveals insights and perspectives that wouldn't emerge from solitary reading. This might mean joining an existing philosophy discussion group, forming one with friends or colleagues, or engaging in online philosophical communities. The specific format matters less than the commitment to engage with others who are also interested in thinking seriously about fundamental questions. If you can't find others to discuss philosophy with immediately, don't let that stop you from beginning. Start reading on your own, and opportunities for discussion will likely emerge as you develop familiarity with philosophical ideas and discover others who share your interests. As you begin this journey, remember that philosophical understanding develops gradually and cumulatively. Don't expect immediate transformation or instant clarity. The benefits of philosophical engagement accumulate over time through consistent practice and sustained reflection. Each text you read, each question you explore, each discussion you have contributes to your growing capacity for philosophical thinking. Also remember that there's no single correct path through the philosophical tradition. Some people are drawn to ancient philosophy, others to contemporary work. Some focus on ethics and questions about how to live, others on epistemology and questions about knowledge and truth. Some prefer systematic treatises, others dialogical works or brief reflective essays. Follow your interests, but also challenge yourself occasionally to explore areas that seem initially unfamiliar or difficult. The goal is not to become a professional philosopher or to master any particular philosophical system. The goal is to develop your own capacity for thoughtful, critical, and creative thinking about fundamental questions. Use philosophical texts as tools for your own intellectual development, rather than authorities to be accepted uncritically. Expect to encounter ideas that challenge your existing beliefs and assumptions. This challenging is not a threat, but an opportunity. An opportunity to examine beliefs you might have held unreflectively, to consider alternative perspectives you might not have encountered otherwise, and to develop more nuanced and sophisticated views about complex issues. When you encounter philosophical arguments that conflict with your existing beliefs, resist the temptation to dismiss them immediately or to accept them uncritically. Instead, engage with them seriously. What evidence or reasoning supports this position? What are its implications? What objections might be raised against it? How might its proponents respond to those objections? This kind of engaged examination is valuable regardless of whether you ultimately accept or reject the arguments in question. Be patient with yourself when you encounter difficulties. Every serious reader of philosophy has struggled with challenging texts, been confused by complex arguments, and felt frustrated by the apparent intractability of certain philosophical problems. These experiences are normal parts of philosophical learning, not signs of inadequacy or evidence that philosophy isn't for you. When you encounter particularly difficult passages or arguments, try breaking them down into smaller components. What is the main conclusion the philosopher is trying to establish? What premises or starting points do they use to support that conclusion? What logical steps connect the premises to the conclusion? Often, apparent complexity becomes more manageable when you analyze it systematically. Don't hesitate to use secondary sources, commentaries, study guides, online resources when you need clarification or context. But use these resources to enhance your engagement with primary texts rather than as substitutes for reading the original works. The goal is to develop your own capacity for philosophical thinking, and this requires direct engagement with philosophical arguments and ideas. As you progress in your philosophical reading, you'll begin to see connections between different philosophers and different philosophical problems. You'll notice recurring themes, evolving debates, and continuing relevance of ancient questions to contemporary concerns. These connections are part of what makes philosophical engagement so intellectually rewarding. You're not just learning isolated facts or opinions, but participating in ongoing conversations about questions that have occupied thoughtful people throughout human history. You'll also begin to develop your own philosophical voice, your own ways of approaching philosophical questions, your own insights about important issues, your own contributions to ongoing debates. This doesn't require original groundbreaking discoveries. Most philosophical progress comes through careful examination of familiar questions from new angles or through creative applications of established insights to new contexts. Your philosophical voice emerges through the process of engaging seriously with philosophical questions and arguments, not through any special talent or training. As you read more widely, think more carefully, and discuss more thoughtfully, you'll naturally develop distinctive perspectives and insights that reflect your own experience, interests, and judgment. The broader significance of your philosophical journey extends beyond personal intellectual development. By becoming a more thoughtful, critical, and reflective person, you contribute to the intellectual health of your communities and society. Democratic societies depend on citizens who can think independently, evaluate evidence carefully, communicate respectfully across differences, and make informed decisions about complex issues. In our polarized and fragmented world, people who have developed philosophical skills and virtues play crucial roles as bridge builders, critical thinkers, and voices of reason. Your philosophical development makes you better equipped to contribute constructively to public discourse, to help resolve conflicts thoughtfully, and to model intellectual virtues that others can learn from. The ancient Greeks had a concept, eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but really meaning human flourishing or living well. Philosophical engagement contributes to eudaimonia not by providing simple formulas for success, but by developing capacities and perspectives that enable you to live more thoughtfully, more intentionally, and more wisely. This flourishing is not just individual, but social. As you become more skilled at philosophical thinking, you become better able to contribute to the flourishing of others through clearer communication, more thoughtful decision-making, greater empathy and understanding, and more effective collaboration on shared challenges. The invitation to philosophical engagement is ultimately an invitation to join humanity's ongoing conversation about the most important questions we face. What can we know? How should we live? What do we owe to one another? What makes life meaningful? How can we create just and flourishing communities? These questions don't have final answers, but they reward thoughtful exploration with insights that can transform how you understand yourself and your world. This conversation has been going on for over 2,000 years, and it will continue long after we're gone. Your participation in it connects you to the deepest currents of human inquiry and reflection. Your questions and insights, however modest they might seem, contribute to the collective human effort to understand our condition and improve our shared life. The philosophical journey you're beginning is both deeply personal and profoundly social. It will change how you think about yourself, while also changing how you relate to others. It will challenge some of your existing beliefs, while providing resources for developing more thoughtful and nuanced perspectives. It will raise new questions while providing better tools for exploring them. Most importantly, it will connect you to something larger than yourself, to a tradition of human wisdom seeking that transcends cultural and historical boundaries, to a community of inquiry that includes the greatest minds in human history, and to an ongoing conversation about questions that matter not just to philosophers, but to everyone who has ever wondered about the nature of reality, the possibility of knowledge, the foundations of morality, or the meaning of human existence. Your philosophical journey begins now. Choose your first book. Set aside time for regular reading and reflection. Find others to discuss these ideas with. Most importantly, bring an attitude of curiosity, humility, and intellectual courage to this exploration. The wisdom tradition is vast and rich, but it's also accessible and welcoming to anyone who approaches it with genuine interest and commitment to careful thinking. The questions that philosophy explores are not abstract academic puzzles, but the most practical and urgent questions any human being can face. Your engagement with these questions, informed by centuries of human reflection and wisdom, will enrich your own life while also preparing you to contribute more thoughtfully to our collective efforts to understand ourselves and create a more flourishing world. The conversation is waiting for you. Your voice belongs in it. Your questions matter. Your journey begins now.